The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television. Major support for Compass is provided by the ongoing support of the Leo P. Flynn Estate of Millbank, South Dakota. Additional support is provided by the Southwest Minnesota Private Industry Council, promoting Southwest Minnesota as a place rich with opportunity. Come for the jobs, stay for the lifestyle. More information at swmnpic.org.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a production of Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass, and this is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, we will discuss the impact of 2016 ballot initiatives in Minnesota and South Dakota. We'll have members of the Minnesota Senate, one member from there, and we'll also have a member from the South Dakota State Senate. And we'll touch on what initiatives play a key part in our region for the coming year. In Minnesota, for example, during the 2016 election, voters approved a constitutional amendment establishing a salary council to determine legislative salaries. One of the authors of the proposal is Senator Kent Eakin. He's a DFL senator from Twin Valley in northwestern Minnesota. I interviewed Senator Eakin via a studio link to St. Paul about his proposal a short time ago. Here is that interview. Hello, Senator Kent Eakin. Thank you for joining us on Compass.
Thank you for having me, Les.
Senator Eakin, your proposal was unusual because it was not something that a lot of voters knew about, but yet it received 77% of the voters' support in the most recent election. And it changes how state legislative salaries are set in Minnesota. Can you tell us how this new system would set legislative salaries in Minnesota?
Sure. It removes it from the legislature and puts it into the hands of a citizens' council. And it's the governor and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that appoint the members of the Citizens Council. They have to choose, each one chooses 8 members, one from each congressional district across the state. And half have to be from one party, half from the other, so it's going to be bipartisan. And so they're selected to serve for 4 years. And those 4-year terms are going to be staggered so that you'll always have half of them who had served on the previous Citizens Council in order to ensure there's some stability there. But nobody can serve on it who has any conflict of interest with the legislature. There are no legislators serving on it, no former legislators serving on it, no spouses of legislators are allowed to serve on it, no staff from the legislature, no lobbyists in the legislature, no judges or former judges or constitutional officers like governor or lieutenant governor or attorney general or any former constitutional officers, no staff from the governors or constitutional officers' offices. So we went to the nth degree to remove every scintilla of conflict of interest from this process, and that's the reason it was done, because it's a direct, glaring conflict of interest that was really built into our Constitution. That really needed to be removed, because we're not being sent to St. Paul to argue about, debate about, and vote on our pay. We're being sent to St. Paul to debate about our constituents' issues. And so that's the reason that I put it forward, and I've been working on it for quite some time. And the voters, as you said, supported it very, very heavily.
Senator, when you talk about legislative compensation, we will often hear news stories about legislative base pay, and then we will hear stories about per diem and mileage and housing allowances, because for rural members such as yourself or rural members throughout Minnesota, when they travel to St. Paul, there are the issues of mileage and housing allowances because they have to be in St. Paul for 3 to 5 months a year. So the new Compensation Council is only going to deal with the base pay part, and then the other parts, the reimbursements, those still remain in legislative control?
That's right. The reimbursements still remain in legislative control, but those are set early on in the session before the Compensation Council would meet. And once the Citizen Council meets, they have to take into consideration, and it says that they have to take into consideration what the other reimbursements are when determining what the base pay should be.
And the base pay right now in Minnesota is around $31,500 per year, and as I understand it, that base pay has been the same since 1999, so a very long time with the same base pay amount. It's the other things that have been adjusted. So how do you think this new council is going to affect the base pay for legislators from now on?
Well, I don't think that, again, it's a conflict of interest for me to be commenting on what the base pay should be. I want to focus on my constituents, not on my pay, but I think that it's important that we have a group that can strike the right balance. People shouldn't go into politics for the money, because it is public service after all. But people shouldn't decide not to go into politics because of the money either, or decide to leave politics because of the money. In other words, you need to strike that right balance. And we're not the ones to be doing it in the legislature, because we do have this conflict of interest. We are not objective, and we need an objective group of citizens who have no benefit to be had in the decision they make to strike that right balance.
Now, Senator Eakin, I know you've been working on this for quite some time, and in your research and working on it, I believe you found that there were other states that have tried this, so this is not an entirely new idea, right? There are some states that have already gone down this road?
Right. There are other states that do this. I know California does it, Idaho does it, it's either Washington State or Oregon, they do it as well, one of those two states. And one thing we found is that they truly are independent. I think that ours is the most independent, because we've gone to a much further degree than any other state in trying to remove conflict of interest. But in California, for instance, they did cut the pay for legislators 2 times in a row for 2 cycles during the time of the economic downturn, when many other state services and positions were being cut. The Citizens Council also decided to cut the legislative pay at the same time. So, and there were fairly significant cuts. So they are truly objective and independent. Not only can they raise pay or keep it the same, they could cut it too if they so choose.
And of course, one of the things that we sometimes hear about in Minnesota is that, as compared to other states, is that some states, being a legislator is considered much more of a full-time job, that there are states where the sessions, instead of 5 months, they may be 8 or 9 or 10 months out of the year that are in session. But in Minnesota, it's still considered a part-time job. And is that another thing that you think is important in this consideration, is that we want to have in Minnesota typically a citizen legislator where people have other jobs that they go to, and does that sort of concept also play into this?
It does, and so they take that into consideration. They have to look at what the workload is, and I know there was testimony given that it's considered on average to be 70% or more of full-time. Although that varies depending on what area of the state you're talking about. It's much closer to full-time in Greater Minnesota, because we have much bigger districts in Greater Minnesota. We represent many more school districts, many more counties, many more cities, all who have boards that we meet with and have to consult with and work with. So the time commitment varies depending on where you're serving from. Also much greater distances to travel, both within your district and to the cities. So and that's one of the reasons that the reimbursements are important in addressing those disparities and the level of commitment, time commitment that's involved between those different districts. But the base pay is what the Compensation Council deals with.
Kent, I know that you have been in the legislature for some time now, and you've been watching this process even before that. So if you were to look into the future ways, and just imagine that we're looking at this issue 4 or 8 or 10 or 12 years from now, how do you think that setting this into the hands of a council will affect the long-term nature of what it's like to be a legislator in Minnesota? Any predictions?
Well, I think they'll strike that right balance. And I think that it's going to get the legislators to focus more on the issues of their constituents rather than on their pay. That was the main reason for doing this. And one thing I found, too, is that when the issue comes up in the legislature and we're voting on it, it's very contentious, very divisive. It creates hard feelings because you're not just voting on your own pay, you're voting on the pay of your colleagues who you're working with. And it becomes an issue in the next legislative campaign. And I think the campaign should also focus on our constituents' issues like education for our children, or long-term care for our seniors and those with disabilities, or roads and bridges for our communities, and not focusing on what our pay should be. So I think the long-term effect is going to be a greater focus on the issues that really matter to our constituents and getting legislators to focus on that rather than on their pay.
I know, Senator Eakin, that you worked on this for a long time, and you got it through one body, the legislature, and eventually through the second body. Why was this, such a driving issue for you that you just didn't let it go? You wanted to keep working on it.
Well, I have a lot of issues that I've held on to and that I keep coming back to fight for. I have another constitutional amendment to create a dedicated fund for long-term care for people with disabilities and seniors who need long-term care services. I've been fighting that battle for a long time, and I'm going to keep fighting for that. So this is one of many, many issues that I've continued to push on. But I did feel it was important because I did feel that we needed to focus on these other issues. I didn't think that it was seemly for the legislature. I think that it makes us look bad too to be arguing about what our pay should be. And I just wanted that issue to be completely removed from the legislative process. So again, we could focus on the issues that matter.
Senator Eakin, as we close this out, I know that there will be some viewers who will want to know more about how this council, how they decide things, what they come up with. Is the best place to find that perhaps through the legislative House and Senate websites?
Yes, you can go there, and certainly, and I haven't been following real closely what the council's been doing. I know they've been meeting now. I know they've been taking testimony, but certainly through the legislative websites you can find more information, and be glad to help out if anybody wants to contact our office. We can certainly put them in touch with those who do know what the Legislative Pay Commission has been doing.
Okay, very good. That's all the time we have today. Senator Kent Eakin, thank you for joining us on Compass. And since our discussion with Senator Eakin, the Minnesota Legislative Salary Council voted to increase the salary for state legislators by approximately $14,000 per year, bringing the annual total to about $45,000 per year. Now, while Minnesota had one constitutional amendment proposal in front of voters in 2016, there were multiple amendment proposals in South Dakota, 5 amendment proposals, another 5 ballot initiatives, and are all on different topics. Here with us to talk about some of those proposals and what happened in South Dakota is State Senator Billy Sutton. Billy is a Democrat from Burke in the southern part of the state, and he's also the minority leader in the state Senate. Senator Sutton, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There were so many different proposals, 10 on the ballot. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'd like to talk about some of the ones that relate to the political process, because that's what we just talked about in Minnesota. And one of them that got a lot of attention was the story about setting up a non-partisan election system, which is something Minnesota had a long time ago. How did that work?
It failed on the ballot. It was somewhat of a surprise to some folks. It's a complicated topic, but I think that some people would say that the reason it failed is because they want to see party affiliation on the ballot. But what's clear in South Dakota, from my experience, is that the public wants to see us work together as Democrats and Republicans, and they want to see that we're getting things done, and we've proven that we can work together and get things done. So it was an interesting debate and discussion.
Yeah, and I know that the idea has come up in other states well of eliminating party designations. One of the other things that has come up in many states is the idea of having a commission decide legislative district boundaries. In other words, a redistricting commission. What did voters in South Dakota have to say about that idea? Because that was on the ballot as well.
Yeah, that was Amendment T, and that was actually rejected as well, which came to probably a surprise from a lot of folks. It's a complicated topic, but what I can tell you and what I do know about it from talking to people, at least in my district and across South Dakota, that when you discuss the implications of redistricting, and you can have a discussion about who should be drawing those lines, you will find very clearly that people think politicians shouldn't be drawing those lines. And so even though it failed on the ballot, I think you'll probably see it again, and I would suspect that in the future people will be more open to it as they become more aware of the system that we're in that really is limiting the public's freedom to choose their elected officials, because you have politicians drawing lines for their district that benefit them. And I think that the jury's still out. We're going to see how it works with these nonpartisan commissions. What I can tell you is that I would contend in South Dakota that the system we have right now hasn't been working as far as redistricting. And so we need to try something different to make sure that we have fair and equal representation in our state capitol.
There was one of the political ballot initiatives, Senator Sutton, that did get approved by voters in the past 2016 election. Tell us about that one.
That was Initiative Measure 22, which did a whole host of things and just hit kind of the main four topics that it hit. Was it limited campaign contributions. We have pretty lax limits in South Dakota, so it sought to make those more strict on what people can contribute to political campaigns. It also created an ethics commission for campaign finance, so if someone was not being honest with how they were contributing, then that could be investigated. And then it also limited lobbyist gifts, so lobbyists could only gift a certain amount. I believe it was limited to $100 per year to an elected official. And then the final piece that was a little more controversial was the public financing piece that was going to create these democracy credits to allow people that maybe don't have much money to use these credits to contribute to campaigns. So that was probably the more controversial piece of that, but overall the voters said that they wanted this reform, and it passed by a majority. And then it got really interesting because then the majority party in Pierre repealed IM-22 and basically threw it out and started over. And I would contend they didn't do anything on campaign finance limitations on contributions, and they didn't replace the Ethics Commission for campaign finance.
And somewhere in the mixture there was a court challenge as well, wasn't there?
Correct. So right after the election, there were a group of legislators that filed a case against this, contending that it was potentially unconstitutional. A judge granted a preliminary injunction, which, to be clear, is not a ruling on its constitutionality at all. So he was essentially saying that it should have its day in court. Well, in the meantime, we had our legislative session, and many of those same people that brought the lawsuit then voted to repeal the law, essentially making the lawsuit go away. So it was really an affront to, I think, direct democracy and kind of an affront to the people's voice to say, you know what, we're going to get rid of this because we know better than you. And the other thing they did that was a little more disturbing is they put an emergency clause on it. Well, in South Dakota, when you put an emergency clause on something, it can't be referred. So the voters couldn't gather signatures to refer it, the repeal, and say, no, we wanted this.
So of the 10 measures that were on the ballot last session, the majority of them did not become law.
Yeah, I think out of the 10, I think 4 of them passed, and then the 2 referred laws actually got defeated, and so you could call that passage somewhat. But the voters said, no, we want to go back to the way the law was prior to the legislature changing it.
So as we look at past elections in South Dakota, I know before we started this segment, you and I were having a brief discussion about the history of initiatives, and having 10 different initiatives on a ballot is not unheard of in South Dakota.
No, it's not. Actually, there's been more in the past. Don't get me wrong, 10 is quite a few. But I think the voters do a good job of working to get informed. And at the end of the day, I'll tell you this, that if they're not sure about a measure, typically they'll be more cautious and vote no, and then it'll fail. So usually if something passes, you really want to pay attention to that. But we were the first state in the nation to have the initiated measure process. The very first one, which is an incredible history, and we've done some really great things on the ballot. You really got to pay attention to what the voters are saying, and we've had more than this in the past. A lot of people say, and there were attempts to limit the initiative measure process in this session and previous sessions to make it harder for things to get on the ballot and to try to change the effective date of initiated measures.
So, Senator Sutton, in the last minute that we have here, I'm going to ask you to look ahead. 2018 is still a ways out there. But as you look ahead to 2018, what do you think we're going to see for another 10 measures on the ballot? Any way to predict what you think the voters of South Dakota will want to see the next time around?
Yeah, I think there's already a pretty good start. There's already been some measures that have been submitted to our Legislative Research Council, who then take a look at those and modify them for style and form revisions and get them in the correct language. So anybody can put an idea out there, then they get it approved by LRC for style and language, and then they go and collect signatures. And there's already been several. We just had our executive board meeting for the legislature the other day. There's already been several submitted dealing with medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, There have been issues put forward on making a constitutional amendment for what IM-22 was seeking to do. So that'll be an interesting discussion in its own right. There's also measures out there that are coming potentially to limit the legislature's ability to change initiated measures once they pass. Because I think you're seeing a frustration from the public that, hey, you're changing our topics. We don't want you to do that.
So a lot more to talk about. I wish we had
Correct.
more time. But Senator Billy Sudlin of Burke, South Dakota, thanks for joining us on Compass.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our topic this week on legislative initiatives in our region. Our Compass producer, Laura K. Prosser, will take it from here and end this week's episode with the next installment of the Compass Literature Corner.